So, good evening. It is such an incredible privilege to welcome all of you here tonight. Thank you for being here as we begin our annual festival and mark our 7th birthday. From a 6-day online festival initiated in 2020 to a 3-week marathon this year, I think we can safely say that we have traveled some distance. I couldn't have imagined a better person to present the keynote address and set the tone for Shudart 2022. And I look forward to a very important conversation this evening. I also hope that this will be the beginning of many more such vital conversations going ahead. Mr. Mehta, thank you again for making the time to be with us tonight. I was first introduced to your writings by my dear friend Radhika Desai, who would often quote from or refer to a recent article by you during our many meetings as the working group to discuss the possibility and idea of G5A, long before I built this warehouse. Kalpana, too, was a part of that wonderful group, and I could not have even dared to imagine at that time that 9 years later, we would all be in this room with Mr. Mehta. So I'm deeply touched, also, Kalpana, that you cut short your trip to be here tonight. So thank you both, and Radhika. In these times when support for the arts is so difficult, I cannot express fully how grateful I am and moved for the generosity and vision of the Bajaj Foundation, who have come on board to support Shudart 2022. So thank you sincerely, Minal and Neeraj. And to the BNP Paribas India Foundation, our longtime partners, who also support a major part of our year-round programming. Thank you, Manisha. Shudart 2022 presents a concentrated version of all that we believe in and strive to do at G5A. And this year, we're very excited to introduce the idea of a resident curator, a concept that Zakir Bhai, the first member of our advisory council, in fact, suggested we include at G5A. And who better than T.M. Krishna to be our very first resident curator? There are very few master artists who have the clarity and courage to address problematic and fraught issues as an integral part of their creative practice. And TM has, of course, brought this courageous discourse to week 3. So I hope all of you will be there. I've always known that working at G5A is a huge privilege, but a privilege that comes with an even bigger responsibility. What is the work we present here, and what do we leave out? Who do we converse with, and who we don't? What do we foreground, and what do we gently but firmly push away? Everyone in our team knows that we carry this enormous burden, but I'm very proud to say tonight that everyone here carries it lightly and in a way that is now internalized fully. Thank you so much, Team G5A. My hope for Shudart 2022 is that each one of us shares in the conversations and presentations in a full and deep way, leaving no room for cynicism or ambivalence. That we carry this idea and energy exchange with us as we traverse our individual worlds and commit to taking a position, picking a side, no matter the implications or consequences. On that note, I think it would be appropriate to welcome you, Mr. Mehta. So Mr. Mehta has requested that since he lectures very often, he's not going to use the podium, and has invited Kalpana to join him on stage.
Okay. Shall we? Yeah. Good evening. It's a real privilege to be here, and frankly, a little intimidating. You're going to have 3 weeks of extraordinary creativity, moral insight, aesthetic grandeur. And, to start off, G5A has taken the risk of putting a boring political theorist in front of this, audience. But it says something about G5A's risk-taking capabilities. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to Kalpana ji for this opportunity, and sorry, Anuradha ji for this opportunity, and to share this podium with Kalpana ji. So what I thought I'd do, because we wanted to make this conversational, I think this is one of those times where, frankly, if any social scientist tells you they know what is going on, they're probably lying to themselves. I begin each one of my classes these days by saying, we wrote the handbook or edited the handbook, Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution. I cannot tell you what the Indian Constitution is today. We did public institutions in India. I cannot tell you how public institutions in India function. It is a time of extraordinary uncertainty and churn, and I don't mean it just in a political sense, that there's a lot of conflict, that there's a lot of polarization. I mean it in a deeper sense, which is that even conflict sometimes requires a fixed lodestar, a framework within which that conflict is taking place, right? We don't have the conceptual repertoire, in some senses, to even begin to understand the nature of the churn that we are experiencing. And I think the first step, in some senses, is, I think, a kind of conversational humility. We probably all have to kind of go back to the drawing board, re-examine our deepest assumptions. And just to highlight that point, I want to place, I'll come to India in about 5 minutes, place the Indian conversation in a little bit of a global perspective. I mean, there are two democracies I've lived in for a long time, India and America, and both share a couple of features in common. We are big, we are pretty narcissistic, and in some sense, we also believe in the mythology of our own exceptionalism, right? No other country like America, or no other experiment like America, no other experiment like India, right? And actually, one way of thinking about our crisis, as I'll try and show in the next 15, 20 minutes, is to actually question the myth of our own exceptionalism, right? But just to begin with the global story, if you look at the post-1945 world order, one way in which that order was often described was a clash between capitalism and communism, right? The two big economic systems, and the political logics that followed those economic systems. And then there was a bunch of us third worlders trying to find a third way, right? But another way of describing that landscape, and I actually want to begin with this point because I think it takes us straight to the question of values, is there were broadly 4 frameworks that were on offer in the global system, right? And by frameworks, I mean something very specific, a way of thinking about the social contract that took a set of questions to be very primary, right? So what were those 4 frameworks? The first was, of course, liberal democracy, right? Broadly speaking, we are free and equal. Broadly speaking, constitutional representative institutions are the best way of expressing popular will and honoring the dignity of the individual, right? This is Western Europe, North America, countries like India, Latin America, on and off. But almost all our debates in these countries worked within this institutional horizon, right? We did not live up to these ideals. Our institutions often betrayed that, and God knows they did seriously throughout our history. But almost all normative debates took this kind of framework for granted, right? I mean, America is still talking in terms of, the 1776 Constitution, right? And this is a social contract of a very particular kind. It makes assumptions about how you treat individuals. It makes practical assumptions about what kinds of institutions will preserve social peace and produce prosperity. There was a second model, very, very powerful, whose power we have underestimated, which was the idea of a party state as a governing form. I think what was interesting about the Soviet Union was not that it was communist. What was interesting was that it had a party state. And in some senses, China is the greatest exemplar of a party state, which for almost 100 years now has, in a sense, dominated Chinese politics. And think of the function the party state performs in China, right? It's like our liberal constitution. All debates happen within the framework of that party state, right? Even the liberals in China, how do we liberalize the party state? The new Confucians, right? Now, the party state was a very specific imagination of politics, that you need a certain kind of mass organization that acts as the vanguard of society, and as Mao put it, solves the contradictions that come up. So the first contradiction is feudalism. Let's go smash the feudal lords, right? The next contradiction is, in a sense, cultural elitism. Let's, in some senses, collapse these elites together, right? The third contradiction is poverty. Let's move. But you get the picture of the centrality of the party state. The third big model, which broadly speaking, if you kind of move from Pakistan to Egypt, right, West Asia, the Islamic world in a very broad sense, was this project of a modern Islamic constitutionalism. Can you have a basic structure, a normative horizon that acknowledges the sovereignty of God in its core constitutional structure, right? So governed by Islamic law in some ways, and yet be a modern functional state. That was actually the normative aspiration behind Pakistan. It's not actually Jinnah, it's Iqbal, right? Possibly Pakistan and Turkey as two exemplars of this. But this vision travels, and again, South Asia has a big role in this. I think Maududi, for example, is one of the most influential political thinkers of the 20th century. Frames debates in Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria, right? That's and all debates happen within this horizon, right? Can you make Sharia more liberal? Can you make it less liberal? Can you make it more democratic, less democratic, right? And the last project, in a sense, at least for my purposes, was Africa, where this great struggle to think of a form of political organization that would ensure that in global politics, the color line of race is not reproduced as a organizing principle of power, right? The Pan-African projects of the 1950s and 60s, South Africa post-apartheid, although it works within the framework of a liberal democracy, but in some senses, the importance of South Africa, the South African experiment, was that this was a potentially prosperous country that could, in some sense, exemplify that project. Now, when we think of the crisis of India, it's a sobering thought to think that all four of these projects are simultaneously in deep crisis, right? What are the signs of this deep crisis? All of them are having to resort to more repression and surveillance. Right? You can see the consolidation of power even within China in some ways, right? The centralization of the party state, the move away from Deng's vision. All of them have this kind of nagging sense of not being able to, under the current configuration, address some of the fundamental contradictions that beset their social and economic systems. And the two most obvious ones, one, of course, is the environment and climate change, which is a global problem. And I don't think it's just a problem at the level of interstate negotiation, that, rich and poor countries can't decide how to distribute the remaining, emission bundle, right? I've just come from Delhi with an AQ high for 600, right? We can't even negotiate our way ourselves out of that problem, right? Environmental climate change, where something existentially important to humanity, right, which calls into question some of the principal institutions that we inhabit or ways of doing business. And the second, in some senses, you might say the classic, the perennial problem of any political structure, the problem of the economy, right? The last 20, 30 years, at one level, were extraordinary for the global economy. Before you dump on neoliberalism too easily, remember this is the period that lifted more people out of poverty from the world than almost any others, right? And yet, it left three crises that pretty much every country is facing at the same time. Good quality jobs, right? The US is struggling with, although technically it's at full employment, but if you look at labor participation, if you look at, in a sense, the stagnation of median wages, right? China is looking down that abyss, right? India has had jobless growth. As you know, the employment elasticity of growth is pretty low, right? And so the political management of the economy has been various short-term measures to, in some senses, deal with this fundamental structural crisis. Some countries doing it by, expanding credit. So you have a debt crisis. In some senses, it's a question of juggling which crisis are you able to deal with in the next 2 years and kick the can down the road in some ways, right? Yeah. So one of the things I think we have to think about when we think of the crisis in India and when we think of the role something like G5A can perform in this conversation is that this could also be a tremendous opportunity to actually think out of these very encrusted, inherited institutional and normative structures that we have gotten so used to, right? The world of technology has changed so much. And yet, look, at the end of the day, we still think only within the horizon of a particular kind of capitalism and a particular form of the nation state, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big advocate of markets. But there are clearly limitations to, in some senses, the current structure. And if you want to get at the particular crisis of legitimacy, right, in some senses, it's not going to be resolved just at the level of the next election, right? Will Trump lose by 3 points? Will, Bolsonaro lose by 4 points? Will perhaps the BJP, vote share go down, right? Because the structural conditions that are producing this global crisis of legitimacy are actually much, much deeper, right? And I think the puzzle for this moment, for artists, for creators, is that when the world faced this kind of crisis, middle of the 19th century, early 20th century, the one thing artists can do is they can actually push the boundaries of our imagination, right? The utopia of the next step in some ways, right? That's, in a sense, their much, much more powerful contribution than actually just thinking of, what position do I take tomorrow and day after. I mean, that's the easy part in some ways, right? So that's, I think, the kind of broad context in which to, and it is my personal view that I think in some ways, when you're thinking of political alternatives, right? Any alternative that doesn't look like it's actually going to effectively address this crisis is actually not going to be sustainable. I mean, to take the Labour Party in Britain, it actually doesn't have anything different to offer, radically different to offer from what the Conservatives do. I mean, they're quite happy Rishi Sunak doing all the dirty work that they don't have to do, right? Think of the Democrats in the US, right? I mean, think of, for example, the housing crisis in the US, right? Absolutely central governance, cost of living crisis. It's amazing no city in the world right now has a decent answer to that question, right? And particularly for a city like Bombay, which has two great advantages, capital and art, right? Delhi has all the troublemakers. That combination, if done rightly, could actually, I think, do wonders in some ways. Now, segueing to India, and I won't take sort of long. Let me say this, which is, when we think of India at the moment, one way of thinking about the nature of the challenge we face is that it is an intensification of the logic of 1947, right? India was partitioned, and there's a reason I'm saying this in some ways. The modus vivendi of partition was going to function only under three assumptions. One, that the states of the subcontinent treat each other as normal states, not like states in a 150-year civil war that is still continuing, which is what, in fact, it is. I mean, India and Pakistan is not a conventional international relations problem, right? Second, there are no spillover effects from one state to the other, right? That 47 modus vivendi holds in some ways, right? And the third was that the internal normative dimension of each of those projects is actually successful, so that Pakistan actually became a relatively successful, right, Islamic State of the kind that at least Iqbal had envisaged, which was deeply problematic. I mean, I personally normatively very problematic, but at least if you took it on its own terms, right? And India's democracy, in some senses, secularism, succeeded on its own terms. We are at this interesting moment where neither of those three assumptions holds. There is spillover effects from one state to the other, both in terms of discourse and the construction of divisive politics. You know, Hindus were expelled from Pakistan, so therefore India has to go down in some senses a certain way. And all countries in South Asia are facing that internal legitimation crisis. Pakistan, of course, much, much more deeply, has been for a while, right? And what has been our answer to that, right? Our answer to that has, let us just intensify the logic of 1947. What is Hindutva at one level, right? Hindutva is, in a sense, simply the proposition, let's bring the logic of 1947 to completion. Not perhaps by literal expulsion. Hopefully, even some of them know that the catastrophic consequences of that, right? But at least by a certain cultural construction of India, where the two questions that partition was meant to solve, right? How do communities share power? We make it absolutely clear, right, that this is a majoritarian country. If minorities want to share in power or cultural presence in this country, they have to conform to, or at least assimilate to, what this majoritarian construction is, right? That's how we solve that problem of representation. Let's just bring it, in a sense, to fruition. And the second proposition, in some ways, which is, again, when, you know, it arises out of pre-partition debates, which is, there were two contending conceptions of India. The contending conception was not, in a sense, the communal one versus the secular one. That, I think, is an easier debate. The contending version was, is India a federation of communities? Or is India going to be a zone of individual freedom and mobility? The reason this distinction is important is because the fault line, social fault lines that we experience, are not just the social fault lines between two communities. That, of course, is now deep, pervasive, and frankly, I've never seen in India not just so deeply communalized. I mean, what's disconcerting about India is the normalization and respectability, that political respectability that communalism has, right? Leaders probably can't achieve much, but the one thing they can do is hold up a norm, right? That this is acceptable and this is not acceptable, right? In fact, I think increasingly that's the only function of leaders in some ways. And now that that norm has been breached, right, you are seeing an extraordinary communalization of a kind that, you know, probably the last period was probably maybe the 1930s, early 1940s. In India, you can also take the European analogies, and we know where that, in some senses, ended up, right? Now, here's the tricky question for culture, I mean, bringing back to the arts, and why I'm mentioning the 1930s. So, for a couple of years, I once decided to read every partition novel I could lay my hands on, in translation or otherwise. And it's truly extraordinary literature. I mean, but there is one common characteristic that runs through a large swath of that literature, which is also reflective, I think, in our duality. Broadly, the narrative goes like this. There was a common culture, civilization, Ganga, Jamna, Tehzeeb, whichever way you want to characterize it, local modes of accommodation, all of these things that had begun to emerge in India over the course of centuries. And then these politicians showed up. Congress shows up, Muslim League shows up, they start mobilizing, and that realm of culture, in a sense, is rendered apart. Right? Now, there is much to this narrative. I don't think it's entirely wrong, that because what it points to is that the challenge of Hindutva is a problem that arises from within democracy and democratic mobilization. Right? Because what was put on the table when politics came to the fore, right? Culture operates in the realm of transcendence, right? The literal meaning of transcender, overcome what you are, right? That's the essence of all culture. That's the essence of all religion, right? Politics operates in this realm of the distribution of power, right? And in some senses, the creation of modern Hindutva is a creation of that problem of representation. Roughly from 1905 to 1947, there are negotiations, right? How do communities get represented, right? Do you do separate electorates? Do you do joint electorates? If you give minorities the veto, are you discriminating against the majority? If you don't give minorities the veto on certain things, will they have adequate protection? And the blunt answer is there was no equilibrium solution to that problem. With partition, we just decided to find a modus vivendi, right? I mean, it got kind of bracketed. But look at our politics right now, right? The question of representation has come back hauntingly, right? And the BJP's great success was to say that actually, even for electoral reasons, you actually don't need to take the minority. In fact, it might help not taking the minority into account. And the worrying thing is almost every other single party believes the same thing. It's the first time in the history of independent India that Muslims do not have a political voice. I don't mean in just the numerical terms, are they represented, right? But a political party that is willing to say, actually, we care for minority rights. So in that sense, right, the duality, and that's the challenge, which is, look at the 1930s, 1940s. You have the best possible political leadership, the most enlightened, this is Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore. I mean, sometimes you say if they couldn't hold it together, right? I mean, what are we, or maybe it's the reverse. Maybe it'll take a bunch of ruffians to hold it together. Who knows, right? But that duality, right, that in some senses the realm of culture and the realm of politics are two ships passing each other in the night. It's a typical experience, right? All of us go to a concert and we all just come out, Sufi, every single sort of, syncretic, transcendental moment, right? The interesting question for culture is whether that illusion that kind of cultural intervention can actually solve the political problem is actually a mistake. It's good intrinsically in its own right? I mean, who would rather not do that? But in some senses, it fails to understand that, in a sense, this problem, right, that we are dealing with Hindutva in some ways, is a problem that comes out of the process of democracy. And Hindutva has deep democratic legitimation. Now, India in some ways is, as I said, we have this myth of our own exceptionalism. That is what 1947 was, our new constitution, right? A democracy will work under unlikely circumstances and produce the strangest country anybody has ever known, 18 languages, this, that. We don't conform to any canonical European nation-state form. At one level, Hindutva actually just wants us to make a European nation-state. Every nation-state in the world has been majoritarian and exclusionary. Let's be very clear about this. I mean, the formation of nation-states in Europe after the dissolution of empires, Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, all of them led to, in some senses, the consolidation of majoritarian ethnic identities in any state. It's not that they did not assimilate immigrants later on, but it was very clear whose state it is, right? Now, our tragedy is we are trying to be a European state. And part of the appeal that the BJP I think trades on is that it melds both things. It melds that appeal to a kind of reactionary, backward-looking politics with also the sense that we are actually the force for this massive state-building, project in some ways that India has hitherto not attempted because it was just too wishy-washy. You take a little, you take a little. It never, in a sense, amalgamated. This obsession with one everything, right? It's actually a pretty common obsession with all nation states. Right? The tragedy is that in the conditions of the subcontinent, if you actually try and create a European-style notion state, it's actually going to be a political, moral catastrophe. As it was in Europe, by the way, right? Pretty much every state either ethnically cleansed before it consolidated as a democracy or cleansed after it consolidated as a democracy. Right? And this urge in some senses, right, that one of the, I think, the worries about the BJP is not just that it's kind of going back, it draws on reactionary themes sometimes. It's actually that it's fired up by a modernist imagination that is actually of a very different kind than what the subcontinent will need in some ways. Just given the practicalities, right? Secularism was not something important from the West. Secularism was a practical political response to conditions of modernization and plurality in India, right? Okay. Now, here's the challenge for us. This stuff has become common sense. Hindutva is the ascendant political ideology, and pretty much everything is now being argued within its frame. The BJP is trying to also emulate the party state model, that all conflicts be negotiated only through the party, including incorporating civil society. Look, even Indian capital now, right? I mean, I know it's a little bit of a graceless thing to say, but the day Mr. Ratan Tata, publicly, I have no issues privately meeting, whatever, I mean, one should engage with everyone. But publicly felicitated Mohan Bhagwat. Think of the message that goes out. It's like the party state, right? Now, the institutional project is now the creation of that state, where all institutions, civil society, universities, cultural institutions, think tanks, in a sense, function within the framework of that party and that party ideology. This is completely uncharted territory. And if you connect the dots, it's very Chinese. Even our wolf warrior diplomacy, where we call up, foreign universities and say, why you invited so-and-so to speak, very much enamored by that party state sort of model. Since we are in Bombay, I think state-capital relations have undergone a massive transformation. I'd never expect capital to be politically active. That's probably not its job, and arguably they have other fiduciary responsibilities. But it's hard to imagine this infrastructure being sustained without the kind of deep support of capital. It's active support. It's not, we don't take a position, we don't engage. Now, what makes life politically complicated for us is many on the center and left think that there will be some kind of economic crisis which will make this model implode. So people might not think Hindutva is a deal breaker, but jobs might be, inflation might be. Just to provoke you, I actually don't think in India that crisis is going to come. I actually think the Indian economy will do moderately well at least. There will be ups and downs, but it will do more for a variety of reasons. Deeper long-term trends in the nature of that economy. Second, it also underestimates the fact that what the BJP, what Hindutva has done, I mean, it plays lots of cards. There's the modernist card. There's the, in some senses, the traditional card. it's brought to the fore this idea of a kind of vernacular imagination, which actually makes India distinctive. And the vernacular imagination is, from a practical political point of view, very important. As I wrote recently, which is one way of thinking about the Congress's crisis is it doesn't have five speakers who can hold an audience together in Hindi in UP or Bihar, right? And we are on this unique experiment where we have decided that all our local imaginings, languages, are languages of the past. So we listen to music in Hindi, Sanskrit, Malayalam, Pali, Prakrit. We do our politics. We do our access to power. We do our self-projection. We do our law courts, all in English. Right? There's no other country in the world where there's a bifurcation between the imagination of the culture and self and the imagination of politics, access, and power. And a lot of, I think, the latent sympathy for this vernacularization of this imagination through temples, through all of this, it's not temples, is that it's actually tapping into this bifurcation. So we'll actually have to think of the realm of culture also very differently. And not, in a sense, confine culture to this, almost escapist mode. I don't mean artists are not taking stands. I don't mean culture is not criticizing the moral kind of condition we are in, right? But it still remains almost on a dual track, I think in some ways. And so the hard work we have cut out for us is that kind of work of cultural and political mobilization, which is not going to come simply from taking positions, although that would at least give the courage to people to do that kind of work. Sorry, I've gone on longer than I... So.
Well, it's not, you haven't gone on too long, and in this short period, you've covered such a lot that, I don't know where I can begin this conversation. But let me begin with the first part where you laid out in the global perspective. And, amongst the many things you mentioned, I felt one of the things you did not mention was the growing inequality.
Yeah.
And which I think is fundamental to the kind of politics that is developing, even in the countries that, at least in their framework, were democratic. So I was wondering whether you could just talk about that a bit.
No, that's a good question. I mean, I kind of very elliptically gesture to it in the economy. So, we are at a bit of an impasse. And if you actually look at debates in economics, I think it actually becomes more and more important. So the first impasse was that over the last 20 years, there was clearly a tension between intra-country inequality and inter-country inequality, right? So I'm a votary of globalization. I actually don't buy a lot of the critiques of globalization for one simple reason, which is that the integration of India and China into the world economy, just in terms of alleviating poverty, it's not a sufficient condition, right? But it was one of the enabling conditions that did that quite dramatically, right? But the flip side of globalization is that intra-country inequality in almost every country goes up, right? For a variety of mechanisms. Some are very explicit political economy mechanisms, captured by crony capitalists, capture of the regulatory system, right? And I think that part is in a sense genuine, and it's not an accident that it's post the 2008-2009 financial crisis that actually there is this kind of wave of political churning all across the world almost simultaneously. Because what that crisis exposed, like the COVID crisis did in some senses, was it exposed that fault line, right? That this idea that there is a kind of free lunch in which everybody is going to get growing together is in a sense simply not on, right? Now, our first reaction to that crisis, again globally, was a kind of anti-corruption movement. Again, not an accident. Xi Jinping went for anti-corruption. Arvind Kejriwal went for anti-corruption, right? Orban goes for anti-corruption. Even in the US, right, in some senses, the left of the US's response was a kind of structural corruption, right? Right? That there is some kind of regulatory capture by elites there. The challenge turns out Brazil, interestingly, in some ways, right? So again, the patterns are really striking that almost all of this happens, roughly. Now, it turns out that that is one important part of the story, but it still left the question unanswered, right? What is the form of that basic economic contract that is sustainable both in terms of growth and produces at least a tolerable degree of equality, right? Now, again, commonality to everybody. Our response to that was the creation of a new welfare architecture. That welfare architectures can mitigate inequality, right? Again, across the world pretty much. Brazil does Bolsa Familia. India does, in the last 15 years, India has had the most impressive expansion of the welfare state that any in history, and it's still continuing, by the way, right? I mean, we can criticize Mr. Modi, but the fact of the matter is on the 4 key indicators of the Oxford Deprivation Index, right? The 3 important ones, sanitation, cooking gas, and electricity, there's huge progress. In fact, a lot of people are actually seeing, in some senses, substantive gains. Free food, cash transfers. I mean, just look at what Indian states are doing. Andhra is now doing almost 1 lakh a year in cash transfers, right? What did the US decide? What did the Biden administration decide? Not just because of COVID, boom, cash transfers, right? Partly because we said, okay, this is administratively easy. It's politically popular. It can help mitigate the rough edges of that inequality. But we are in some senses back to square one, because what we are still struggling with is the question of the employment elasticity of capital, right? How do you actually create economies where people can participate on productive terms? And I think that's where, I think that's the crisis. And I don't think that crisis is quite captured just by the fact of inequality. I mean, let's not forget, right? Scandinavia has exactly the same crisis and the same political crisis. That social democratic model has also lurched rightward in some ways, right? And that's why I actually do think it is an interesting moment where, we've now gone through this experiment. Our first macroeconomist said, let's put conventional macroeconomists on the rack, right? MMT, all of that stuff. It's just turning out to be a much, much more intractable problem. And this is something that I think cuts across both left and right. I don't think the left has the answers to this either. In fact, what's interesting about left and right is how actually pretty similar the architectures of their economic policy still are, despite everything, right? I mean, there are shades of difference. But this basic thing, somehow if we can get the top 10% to produce some growth and our tax collections go off enough, we can maybe do enough to create that, social contract. But the crisis of job production remains.
Yeah, but, coming to the specifics of India, for instance, it seems to me that even though there has been growth, the reason I bring in inequality is, though you say that on certain indicators India seems to have done well in terms of the welfare outputs, when you look at other indicators, for instance, child malnutrition, maternal mortality, poor people's access to health, on all those, India has really gone down, or at least not gone ahead.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And therefore there is this complete imbalance between, what is projected as growth and a growing economy, and where we can't call ourselves third world in that sense. And on the other hand, the reality where, I mean, look at us sitting here in the city of Bombay, where you talked about the housing crisis in the US. I mean, this is a city which over the years has simply not handled it,
absolutely.
And homelessness has grown hugely during these 2.5 years of COVID because of the number of people who've been laid off and without a job and no hope of getting anything. And yet there doesn't seem to be any either concern or passion to get something done about it. It's almost as if just as we are accepting, what you were saying about the partition, the fact that Hindus and Muslims are separate, and, we just accept that that is the way the country is, and therefore people are buying into the BJP agenda of, Hindus are the majority, this is a majoritarian state. It's also as if we of a particular class have accepted that this country will always have this huge number of poor people, deprived, even as we boast of being, the third largest economy and whatever. So my question about, the reason I bring this up is because it plays into politics. And so how would you say that, the party state has that, the fact that it is emerging in so many countries that began as democratic states, has the fact of the kind of economics that has led to this schism and deep divide between the people who are at the bottom who keep going lower and people at the top who go higher and higher. Has that, to put it simply, has that contributed to this kind of concentration of power in a person, a party, and its legitimation within a democratic framework of people believing that this is going to be the solution?
No, that's a really deep formulation. So I think I'd unpack sort of 3 or 4 different facets of it, right? So the first is that, in a way, if you think of what India is good at, right, in terms of what state capacity has been good at, traditionally it's been much better at things which you can do in mission mode, which are one-shot things, right? So India is not bad at doing vaccines, for example. It was historically not bad at running elections if nobody interferes, right? Okay.
It tried literacy in mission mode.
But anything that requires a complex negotiation over recurring transactions, right, is a governance failure across political parties. And that's why I actually think I think it is important to see that it is actually something that, in a sense, transcends left, right, center sort of distinction, right? Now, we then bought the idea. So there are 2 responses, right? So one was, of course, the pure trickle-down idea. Well, maybe let's not just worry about this, right? And certainly there were parts of the Indian state where this was quite the dominant ideology. I mean, sometimes in Delhi in the mid-2000s, you'd get this, sort of glib answer. Look, India's 36% savings rate, that translates into 29% investment rate. I mean, what can go wrong, right? So one was that pure trickle-down thing. Fortunately, most politicians don't believe that. Not a single politician believes that, actually, right? But the architecture of the welfare state that they decided to construct was one that they thought had 2 advantages. One, from a governance point of view, simpler, right? Improving the quality of education is really, really hard. And again, across governments, we have failed on this. I mean, there are some distinguished professors in the audience. I think they'll testify. There isn't a single chief minister, who you can say was a model, for example, on higher education, right? So our solution was, in a sense, the kinds of welfare things. That's one of the fascinations of cash transfers, right? You don't actually have to do much governance. Once you've identified the beneficiaries, you just put the money into account. But how do you improve learning outcomes in school? We don't, right? So politicians pretty much figured that actually this is a win-win, because in the short run, it also allows you to create political coalitions, particularly if you can get the people to attribute these things to your benevolence. And one of the big differences between the 2 political parties is that the BJP is incredibly good at doing that. I mean, most people think of Narega as a BJP scheme, right? I mean, just to take one of the most, right? But this welfare architecture, in a sense, has its limitations. If you look at where India is right now, if you look at what's going well and what's not going bad, it's not an accident. We are doing decently in digital infrastructure. We are actually doing much better in infrastructure creation. And again, this is a secular trend, started with the first Vajpayee government, accelerated through the Manmohan Singh years, right? Roads, ports, airports, there's actually, in a sense, a bit of a turnaround, right? But the two areas where there isn't, which is the ones you mentioned, which is health, education, and now increasingly the environment, which are exactly those complex democratic negotiations. It's not just a question of saying, go distribute this one time and in a sense, end of the story. There are also no political incentives for it. You're not, if you get individual treatment, and that's the point about private public goods, right, which come with somebody's photograph on it. It's a good you feel that's directed at you. Quality of public education, you'll probably see the effects in 10 years, right? So in some senses, the political economy, it's not that we are not spending on welfare, but the political economy of welfare is very much now on this kind of private-public goods kind, and the result you're seeing. So we've gotten much better at PDS, for example, one-time distribution, and even critics of PDS now agree that that's one of the things that in some senses has, provided a certain kind of floor, right? But doing PDS is one thing, doing nutrition is a completely different thing, right? And that's, and the challenge for our political coalition part is most voters will not see a substantial difference between the two parties on those particular kinds of things. In fact, actually, most parties are pretty similar on that, including regional and state parties. So that's no longer a differentiating factor where a party can, in some senses, run and saying, look, we think we have the governance capabilities that is actually going to finally crack this problem.
And therefore, you're saying that
so,
because they're all on the same, the additional thing to get that would be what?
So once you don't have, in some senses, economics as an axis of contestation, both because all parties have practically consensus on the model. I mean, the continuities between the BJP and UPA are striking in economics, actually. I mean, there are some changes, but that's largely because the world context has changed, right? Then what is the differentiating axis of mobilization, right? Plus, you've also decided, and that's where I think the diagnostic and the politics are linked in odd kinds of ways, which is the US decided, and what happens in the world actually matters to us a lot. I mean, it's amazing, again, how these models percolate, is the US decided that what is to blame for inequality is globalization, right? Now, actually, we should not be buying into that narrative because, frankly, we were beneficiaries of integration into that economy, right? But they've decided that the way, and this is true of the left of the Democratic Party, the way you actually can produce more equality is in some senses by going America first, right? The result is, in some senses, now everybody is, in a sense, responding to exactly that model, right? But even within that model, so if you take, for example, the production-led industrial scheme, right? Now you could argue, okay, maybe it might help manufacturing at the margins. But what's interesting about what India is doing is it's concentrating largely in the capital-intensive sectors, right? So the joblessness, the crisis of joblessness, right, will in some senses remain. What we are just hoping is that the top 20% can produce enough growth to generate enough revenue to continue with that welfare coalition, which will run out of steam at some point.
Okay, before I open it up, just as we are talking on art and culture, I thought if you can expand a little more on this question of the vernacular,
Yeah.
especially in our Indian context, because I mean, we are having this conversation in English, and I think now, at least with translations into English, much of the great literature that comes out in Indian languages, I shouldn't even call it vernacular, is being read by people around the world. But it's taken a long time. And but if you then mesh it with the politics of majoritarianism and of the language, the Hindu project that is now being pushed, then do you think this is something that can be done without locating it within that politics, or of its own because it has a value? Or is it something that will inevitably feed into that same ideological kind of?
Well, it's a
I don't know whether I put it clearly, but
so I think two. I mean, there are lots of. It's a very big question. Want to get the audience in. So here's one first cut at it, right? So one of the demands that the process of nation formation always generates is the question of history and memory. How do you tell the story of the past of this community that has now become a community of fate, right? And it's both history and memory. History is what professional historians do. History is, the study of the past. Memory is, in some senses, that usable mythology that you want to, in a sense, lose in the present. Right? Now, there are conversations around history and mythology that are entirely legitimate. Not just entirely legitimate, but in some senses that contestation and churn was inevitable. Because there were issues about who authorizes these histories, what are the methodological premises on which they, in a sense, they were conducted, right? The challenge for our politics, and in that sense, India is, again, interesting, where we made the mistake of saying that, and this was a mistake shared both by the right and the left. I mean, using them kind of as placeholders. I'm sure you'll know the reference. They both shared the same premise, that the project of modern India post-1951 depends on telling a story about our past, right? So if you say the story of past is relatively a story of harmony and the creation of a common culture, civilization, then you get modern secularism. If you say this is a story of conflict, invaders, then you get its opposite. But I think what was the mistake was that both are coming at it from the same perspective. This was one thing Gandhi got absolutely right. I mean, he just, he said, why are you interested in history in the process of nation formation? Because, I mean, this is a fool's errand, right? Are we supposed to revise the modern constitutional project if by perchance tomorrow you discover another manuscript that chronicles some atrocity in the 15th century? But it is something, I think, for those of us who think of ourselves as secular historians to actually think about, that we, in a sense, arrogated to ourselves this idea that the future of India depends on, in some senses, telling this cultural story. Whereas ideally what should happen in democracy is, let the historians debate, let this debate, happen in culture. But nothing about your citizenship rights depends on getting this past story right. So that's, I think, one big churn. And I think we handed this to the BJP on a platter, right? It just came, it kind of opened it up, and of course, all kinds of falsehoods, distortions about what other people were saying, all of that. But what's interesting is how we got caught in that history trap. And we are still in that history trap. Yeah. Look, like we can have an academic debate about Savarkar, but it's almost as if the future of India turns on, getting what Ambedkar and Savarkar did, right? I mean, we are not in a sense transcending them. So that's, I think, one issue. The second one, which is, I think, the harder one about, and you're right that, the word vernacular is not the right word. In fact, one of the challenges is we actually don't have a word to describe the linguistic condition we are in some ways, right? You say regional, that almost sounds like it doesn't have any cosmopolitan content. You say vernacular, it's already second class. And yet you are actually trying to mark out the fact that language has a particular kind of state, right? So the translation and stuff will in a sense happen, and we forget that actually translation into other Indian languages was always easier and actually still the best way to access literatures of other, I think, Indian languages. But, I'm picking on him because we probably share the same experience. Dr. Ashwini Kumar is here. If you visit universities, right? Actually, even Delhi University, even JNU, right? 75 to 80% of your students are not comfortable in English. Now, we basically, our response is to pretend that they don't exist. Right? That's the blunt response at teachers. That's how we do, right? Now just expand that horizon, right? Go from Rajasthan to Patna and Calcutta, right? You have first generation learners. And remember, nationalism, linguistic issues actually intensify as education spread, as a new middle class begins to emerge, right? Whose first encounter in the world, they're quite happy to learn English. Nobody is, the good thing about India is we're quite pragmatic at a personal level about language. It's like software, if you need Microsoft, we'll get it, right? But you have an education system where your first, in a sense, linguistic experience is that this very thing that is the most intimate to you, right, is confined to the realm of language and culture. And by the way, the at least in Hindi, I can say the Hindi establishment was as much responsible for it as anybody else. I don't think this is as much a victim story that there was a large, right? Now, that access to language, the fact that language is a marker of advantage and disadvantage, right? There was one problem India solved well, which was, hopefully we'll stick with it, which is not imposing one language. We see what that did to countries like Sri Lanka. But so long as you are in a linguistic universe where there is an unstated, daily enacted hierarchy of language, particularly what it does for access to power, prestige, right? You will, in a sense, get that, and nobody tapping to it. I mean, people forget one thing I say about Jawaharlal Nehru. Anybody, my Marxist friends used to call Jawaharlal Nehru the last bourgeois. He was called the last Englishman. The kinds of things the BJP says. Remember, the left used to say all of this. Just go and listen to Jawaharlal Nehru's campaign speeches in Urdu and Hindi, right? It was a genuinely bilingual generation where at least you did not feel that there is this kind of linguistic distance. In the regional languages, since we are in Maharashtra, right, I think in one level, what has the BJP done? It has taken all the regional models and nationalized it. What is the Tamil Nadu model, right? Use the anti-Hindi thing to, in some senses, give the political identity to a language, create a welfare distributionist state, right? Very tightly controlled by party structures. No state believes in freedom of expression. Let's be very clear. These models of regulating universities and stuff was first perfected by state government, which destroyed all their universities. Look at Calcutta, look at Bombay, look at Pune. The BJP has basically just nationalized it, right?
Well, that's a very good note to open it up to the audience. So I will request people to ask a question, introduce yourself and ask a question and not make a statement. Who would like to go first? Yeah.
My name is Raghu.
Speak into the mic so that we can hear. Yeah.
My name is Raghu. You briefly mentioned the role of art in these times, and, a couple of interesting phrases I thought you used. I just wanted to, draw your attention to that and maybe expand on that. You mentioned the role of art in terms of pushing the boundaries of imagination and also imagining the utopia of tomorrow. Any models you've come across where the arts or culture has played a significant role in solving some of the large problems or even, smaller problems that we face today?
Question.
Do you want to collect a couple?
Yeah, let's get a couple more and then we can. Anyone else? Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Mehta. Thank you for that very interesting talk. I just wanted to point out that you said that we are in a situation today close to the 1940s and 1930s and 40s. So in a sense, we are standing in front of an abyss. That is what it almost suggests. So what would you say if you were to chart a trajectory, if you were to just say that follow that this development, what do you think is going to happen? What would you predict? And I think it's obvious some of the things that might ameliorate it, but given our circumstances, what would you say would ameliorate it or help to, diffuse it to some extent?
Would you like to take these two and then ask later?
Thank you for two wonderful questions, and they're related in a strange kind of way. So, one common thread, I think, that connects the two questions is, and this is something that doesn't just apply to artists. I mean, it's, I think, all of us in some ways, in different ways, whichever profession we are in, right? So India has no lack of imagination. I mean, God knows, that's one thing we are just extraordinarily blessed about. I mean, there's, and whenever one's the two things that help overcome despondency is, one, engagement with the arts. The second is often talking to younger people. I mean, our generation left a mess. Hopefully they'll be much more creative. They're struggling. We made it harder for them. But I think the crisis we are facing, right, is what is it that makes for credible articulation of art? And I'm talking about there's a word I've kind of gotten fixated on over the last few years, which is this word credibility, right? It's not about skill. It's not about imagination. It's not about putting out something beautiful. It's why should somebody trust this thing, right? And I think what's made our life harder in some ways, partly because of the communication environment we live in, is how do we project that whatever this is that we are doing, right? Singing a song, having a protest concert, doing a painting, is actually not encased in a logic that has nothing to do with the art itself. So in that sense, commercialism has always been the enemy of the meaning of art, right? It's the paradox of art. It needs patrons and support, right? But in a sense, art as a commodity imposes an external meaning on that art which is not intrinsic to it, right? Considerations of power, right? Considerations in some senses of partisanship and political mobilization. So I wrote a foreword to T.M. Krishna's book, who we absolutely adore and idolize T.M. But it is a slight disagreement I have. I actually think art has to be political, but in a different way, right? And the final challenge we are facing, which is actually something I'm sure, which is all communication, right, in some senses requires a context. There's a shared background sense of meaning that we take for granted in the context in which a particular portrait, piece of art makes sense. one of the biggest difficulties of our time, right, and why almost nobody survives with their credibility intact in this world, is actually not the wrongs that they do or the crimes they commit. Those are easy. I mean, that's always been the case. It's that you have no stable context for communication, right? I mean, let's just do a simple act, right? Let's say you paint a Ganesh and you put it on your Twitter handle tomorrow. Yeah? It's 55 different meanings, right? Acha, Hindutvavadi Ganpati, brilliant artist. I mean, you can play the script, right? Because in some sense, and the ability of our communication times where everything can be decontextualized and recontextualized, right, is actually making the meaning of art much harder to communicate and stabilize. Because, and you know, at once, look, there were downsides to the old world where art, you know, presupposes certain kinds of community norms and all of that. I mean, it has its limitations, right? So I think one of the challenges, I think artists, I mean, this you know, I don't know how to respond to it, but I think that's actually one of the bigger challenges, I think, that the act of communicating, whether we do it through art or whether we do it, I mean, there is literally no piece of writing you can do which will not justifiably offend someone, right? You can, when you decontextualize, you can even read a silence in a piece of work, right? Right? This is, I think, an unprecedented situation for us, I think, in some ways. And I don't think we've actually quite understood how to overcome this. Right? Now, there was a German writer, Robert Musil, who once wrote this wonderful essay, I think it's called On Stupidity or something, where he distinguishes between two kinds of stupidity and says one is very good for artists, the other isn't. And he's writing under the specter of authoritarianism and incipient fascism, you know, and he's very troubled by it. He says there's one kind of stupidity which art requires, which is the precondition of art, is a kind of stupidity that's almost a certain kind of naivete, where you can do art in a way in which you actually don't second guess any purpose to it, right? Will it serve a political purpose? Will it fetch money? Will it get this, right? And he says, look, that's the kind of stupidity you need to project and recover in order to convey your credibility as an artist, right? The second kind of stupidity, which is what he attributed to the fascists, was the stupidity that actually wants simplification of everything, right? There's a kind of punitive stupidity, which is the solution to everything is let's find a big stick and in some sense get on with it. Let's even for the economic crisis, right? So I think the challenge is not going to be, I mean, there are models in some ways of, you know, as I said, we are not lacking artists. In fact, in some senses, the democratization of these mediums has created, in a lot of sense, it's astonishing what, you know, and I think G5A captures a lot of that. But the harder question is, how is that meaning, in a sense, being received and stabilized, right, under these very disparate conditions of community? That's, I think, the bigger challenge. And that's, I know it's not a very helpful response, but I think that's part of, I think, the challenge for us in answering the second part of your question, which is, why should anybody trust us, right? Because ultimately, look, all social communication and resistance is an act of trust. I mean, again, using Nehru's example, and even, you know, Mr. Modi, when you see Nehru in election campaigns, right, I actually think at some level, like now, the specific content of what he says is somewhat secondary. What moves people, with what even his critics at the time acknowledged, his fiercest critics, was the presumptive sense in the people, he's up to generally something good. I mean, you know, there may be a few things there, right, in a way. And in some senses, that allowed him, right, to be able to articulate his ideas, in some senses, partially institutionalize them. Our problem is not, ideas, it's not principles. In fact, we are so good at taking the right positions, right? We are actually super good at, in some senses, this is the thing to say at this moment to make sure that our virtue is rightly signaled. The question we are not asking is, why doesn't anybody trust us? Any of us, right? What kind of political work does that require, right? And let's face it, the right has been much better at that political work, which is it actually does ground level work, which we don't, right? A lot of it will be good old-fashioned politics. The left and the center were prisoner of this idea that society is simply an amalgam of predetermined social identities. We just get the arithmetic right and we'll win, right? It's the right that actually took over that modern stream. No, identities are actually created through the work of articulation and mobilization, right? And that stuff, the non-right has become terrible at, right? In part because, maybe because we are just so confident that we are saying the right thing that we are just scratching our heads. Why should anybody not believe? In some sense, so the answer will actually have to be old-fashioned politics. In some ways, it's not what the now the couple of things that can easily, I think, can be done is one, particularly because we are talking about elite circles here. Elite politics matters disproportionately. That's why they are elites. By definition, an elite is that section of society that has disproportionate power, right? Ideational power, informational power, economic power, right? The first step is to say, can we draw some bright lines even within these elites, right? Let's not get into a lot of complicated debates, let's say, about history and stuff. But what are some of the non-negotiable red lines, right, that actually put somebody beyond the pale of moral approval? Now, in a democracy, the one simple one is, you should not target somebody simply for what their identity is. I mean, if you can get just that, right, we're 50% of the way. The rest of the stuff is, in some senses, quite negotiable. Who is funding this infrastructure of hate? As I said, look, I think Indian capital cannot now say this is just an abdication of duty. It's actually a positive investment in the infrastructure and information order that sustains and produces this, right? Democracies that are survive have ones where there is actually enough division within capital to actually counteract. India is far gone. I mean, it's just completely gone down that road, right? That's, frankly, let's put it bluntly, it's all of us funding it, right? So maybe that's the first place to begin that conversation, right? And to say that, look, what used to be 15, 20 years ago innocent because its consequences were contained by a political context that was different, is actually no longer that innocent, right? Maybe that's, but that'll actually, I mean, the hardest part of this is that'll involve conversation within our families. That's what makes it so difficult in some ways.
Can we have two last questions? Yeah, Ashwini and the two young women. Yes, okay, let's start with them first.
Yeah.
I'm partial. Yeah.
My question is
Speak into the mic and tell us who you are.
Hello, my name is Astha Singh. My question is actually a follow-up to what Sir said before about art should be political but in a different way. My question is specifically in the context of cinema, the purpose of cinema in today's times when it's not just the Indian film industry but globally when, and even talking about India where the Indian film industry is going through a crisis of its own for various reasons, one of them being, the fallouts of the COVID-19 crisis. Coming back to the debate of what is the purpose of cinema, but this is specifically within the framework of it undergoing a crisis of its own, what is the purpose of cinema when the old contested debate is that cinema is not for edification but for entertainment? What is your personal take on this contested argument, sir, within the reality that it is undergoing a crisis of its own?
Hi, my name is Nafisa. I'd like to hear about your thoughts on the situation in Kashmir in the context of your talk, if that's all right.
And Ashwini?
No, thanks, Pratap. It's a very profound talk you gave. On a very lighter note, I had a very wonderful conversation with Amish Tripathi recently at Sahitya Academy. So kind of linking, Rama, he's doing all kinds of Rama stuff, very innocent of history, myth, etc., etc. So I would like to, hear more your reflection in terms of nationalism, I'm not talking about civic nationalism. I find a link between, who has sold 12 million copies. I hardly sell any copy. I'm a poet. Struggle with just 2,000 copies of my Banaras I sold. And he speaks, Awadhi, he connects very well to the masses. Do you find any connection in terms of the popular culture and the rise of this sort of nationalism in the country? Thank you.
Oh, okay, I'll try and be briefer this time.
Sorry.
I kind of
Well, we'll,
tend to forget there's not
we
a
won't
class
take
for-
any more
right,
questions
yeah,
after
yeah.
this, so you
I'm
can
done.
take your time.
No,
Yeah.
no, so let me answer yours in the cinema question first, and then we'll end with the Kashmir one, difficult one. So, there are different kinds of crises of the cinema, as you know, right? One is, of course, just the conditions of production. And look, it's not a secret, that in this political climate, you can't finance certain kinds of things, the kinds of support structures you need. I mean, I think there's that material crisis of cinema that is actually quite serious, right? And let's not pretend Indian cinema has always been shaped by that material crisis. I think everybody here is too young to remember the days when cinema was not considered a legitimate business and what it did to the political economy of Indian cinema, right? But that crisis is severe. I mean, and let's not, I think, make light of it's going to get worse, right? I mean, producers are going to be told not to produce certain kinds of films. Other kinds of films will not be distributed. So there's a kind of material crisis, right? The second level, in some senses, I think, this may be a slightly unfair comment, but as a pure, unabashed film goer, I'll see any film just because it's there. I actually do think Hindi cinema is deeply confused about what now these discrepant contexts are, which it is trying to address, right? So that old joke about, if you get a committee to do a horse, they'll produce a camel, right? Bollywood in particular, this is an unpopular opinion amongst young people. I mean, it produced pretty bad cinema mostly, okay? But what it did produce was an absolutely sublime grammar of emotions, right? Music, I mean, that was its great, right? We decided we're going to give that up. Now, what is the frame in which we are operating, right? The good political film, the old story, the good political film always shows it does not tell. Just namely one contemporary director in a political film who does not succumb to the temptation that I need to tell. The minute you do that, you, in a sense, fall into that, and this will correct itself. Look, India is such a creative country. I don't think it's, maybe it's just in a sense a phase that going to where there is this question of how do you situate cinema in the context of that larger national life. And that goes to the nationalism question in some ways, right? Which is, the nationalists have it easy, right? Which is, they found a context, they found the political mobilization and support. It's tapped into, in a sense, this triple desire. One, now, high time somebody made a film on the Cholas, whatever the kind of context it is. I mean, that's not an illegitimate sort of which in a sense brings that kind of grammar. It taps into the idea that since so much of the part of the national conversation is in a sense tied to that historical representation, right? There's a kind of affective element to all of these films. It's not just a film about the Cholas, right? It's not just a film about, ex-king or, Tanaji or whatever, right? So it's tapped into that nationalist affective dimension quite clearly. And what it promises, when we think of the vernacular imagination, right? It's not just in a sense a question of language. And this is a thing we struggle with in India, where part of the challenge of secularists was they bought into that, that Hindutva thing, Hinduism is a way of life. In one very significant way. I mean, so think of a standard syllabus in Delhi University. We all got upset. They've removed Ramanujan's great essay on the many Ramayans from the syllabus. But think of a pedagogical context where you actually can't teach the Ramayana, but you can actually teach an essay that has 6, Freudian, Marxist, other interpretations of Ramayana, right? Because the vernacular was not just about the language, right? The vernacular, in a sense, was just about all of this, in a sense. I mean, when you're talking about, what are you talking about here, right? It can have all of these multiple meanings, right? And I think Hindutva's greatest imaginative success has been to, in a sense, say that our imagination, in a sense, can we people it with reference, right? That are exactly of, in some senses, this. That is Amish's, great success and great game. That's the fascination, in some senses, of, now what one hopes in some ways, right, is there will be much better directors and much better scripts who will do it in ways that are, in some senses, there'll be a kind of Rahi Masoom Raza script, as opposed to what we are, in some senses, getting. But they have, in a sense, tapped into the thing. The Kashmir question is a very difficult one, partly because it's very hard to know what's happening on the ground. Look, one way you can judge it simply by saying both militancy is still very high and state repression is still very high, right? So those two remain, notwithstanding to this, the two statistical points we have on this, which are the signs of a dysfunctional policy in some ways. Right? Now, and what the state's end game in this, like everything they're doing, it's going to be both incremental, and the changes will be instituted at a point where they're sure where they can execute. This is the one thing the BJP is actually good at, for the most part, that it first consolidates enough repressive informational power to then, how long that process takes, what that judgment is, we don't know. But the challenge, and in a way why the Kashmir question is important, goes back to the point I started with about 1947, right, is the one thing Sheikh Abdullah was absolutely right about, you can disagree with him on many counts, was there is no resolution to the Kashmir issue possible without a broader India-Pakistan understanding. That has kind of remained true since 1947. I mean, in some sense, Kashmir is the collateral damage, very horrendous collateral damage, right, by both states, in some ways. But we are now in an unprecedented situation where, even compared to the last 15 years, where there is no political articulation allowed in Kashmir, right? I mean, it's political as you would colloquially understand the term. What that will do to both, in some senses, the sheer human suffering it's going to cause, right? And it's extraordinary when you visit Srinagar. I mean, in Kashmir, everybody is an artist and a writer these days. In part because that's the only thing they can sort of, do. But the conditions of that expression, I mean, the number of journalists who are under arrest in Kashmir, the risks of what you can do. The one thing I can tell you in Indian media, try doing a story on Kashmir and see what happens to you, right? So in one sense, Kashmir has become even more invisibilized, even though paradoxically there are more people, in some senses, going to, in a sense, going to Kashmir. And I think the state is just confident that, India is a large state, it can sit on it and somehow, at some point, right, either the problem gets repressed or goes away. But I think that's a kind of object lesson in some ways, right? That whenever India has tried democratic incorporation, usually it has succeeded. Wherever it has tried repression and authoritarianism, in the long run, it's going to sow the seeds of, in some senses, resistance and demise.
Well, we could go on and on because I'm sure there are many more questions and comments. Let me just say that I think what we've missed out, particularly in the last 2.5, 3 years, is the possibility of this kind of conversation. And I think many of us really feel the loss of it, because to reduce it to Zoom and WhatsApp arguments does not cover the kind of range that we've already had this evening. And I think really looking ahead, this is so important that we have this, because I don't think any of us have arrived at what we understand about so many things, regardless of our age. Many of us grew up actually with these intense study circles and, where we debated ideas and articulated freely even half-formed ideas without being afraid that somebody was going to box us into this or that or the other. And through it evolved some kind of understanding. And sadly, much of that has disappeared, from our public space, not only because of COVID, but also because of the polarization that has taken place in society, where we all now only seek out our own echo chambers and speak to people we agree with, rather than actually trying to engage with those with whom we have a different point of view. So I think I want to thank Anuradha that G5A is making this effort to create spaces for conversation, because I think these are really important in terms of any future we want for this country as a democratic country which is open and which is welcoming of difference, which has disappeared. So I'm not supposed to give the vote of thanks, but this is my personal vote of thanks to Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who I have read for many years, and I'm happy to have had a chance to meet you today and to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much.